May 6, 1941. Republic Aviation, Farmingdale, New York. Lowery Brabham had test-flown everything Republic Aviation built. He'd wrung out the P-43, wrestled with prototypes that killed lesser pilots, and earned a reputation for bringing back aircraft that shouldn't fly. But standing on the tarmac that spring morning, staring at the XP-47B, he wasn't sure even he could get this thing airborne. "Jesus Christ, Alex," he muttered to Alexander Kartveli, Republic's chief designer. "It looks like a milk jug with wings." Kartveli, a chain-smoking Georgian immigrant with a thick accent and thicker stubbornness, didn't flinch. He'd heard every insult, every objection, every reason why his design wouldn't work. The Army wanted a high-altitude interceptor. The Germans were building fighters that could operate at 30,000 feet. America needed something that could match them. Kartveli had given them exactly that, just not in the package anyone expected. "Is not beauty contest, Lowery," Kartveli said, lighting another cigarette. "Is engineering." The prototype squatted on the concrete like a pregnant whale, 9,900 pounds empty, 65% heavier than anything Republic had built before. For context, that was heavier than some twin-engine aircraft. The British Spitfire, beloved by pilots on both sides of the Atlantic, weighed barely 5,000 pounds. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109, terror of the skies over Europe, tipped the scales at just over 4,000 pounds empty. The P-47 weighed more than both of them combined. The enormous cowling hid an 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine that produced more power than some bomber formations from the previous war. 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, with the promise of more as engine development continued. Behind the cockpit, buried in the fuselage like a mechanical tumor, sat a General Electric turbo supercharger system so complex that mechanics would need 3 days of training just to understand the ducting that snaked through the rear fuselage. "Army wants high-altitude interceptor," Kartveli continued, gesturing with his cigarette. "Germany has altitude. We have this." They laugh now. They stop laughing later. Brabham walked around the aircraft, his experienced eye noting every unconventional detail. The massive four-bladed Curtiss electric propeller, 13 feet in diameter, bigger than anything in the American inventory. The greenhouse canopy that offered exceptional visibility, but added weight and drag. The landing gear that looked too delicate for the mass it would need to support. The wings that seemed almost too small for the fuselage, giving the whole aircraft an appearance of being simultaneously too big and not big enough. Everything about it violated every principle of fighter design he'd learned in 2 decades of flying. Fighters were supposed to be light, nimble, elegant, aerial ballerinas that could dance through the sky. This thing looked like it belonged hauling freight, not fighting. "What's the expected climb rate?" Brabham asked, knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "At sea level, maybe 2,000 feet per minute," Kartveli admitted. "Spitfire climbs at 3,000. "Great. So it's heavy, slow to climb, and looks ridiculous. What does it do well?" Kartveli smiled, a rare expression on his usually dour face. "Everything else. You fly it, you see." The first flight lasted 43 minutes and changed everything Brabham thought he knew about fighter aircraft. Takeoff was alarming. The massive propeller generated enormous torque that tried to roll the aircraft left. Brabham compensated with hard right rudder, felt the tail come up, felt the main gear protesting under the weight. The aircraft accelerated slowly, painfully slowly compared to lighter fighters. He was halfway down the runway before it reluctantly consented to fly, clawing into the air with all the grace of a thrown brick. At 2,000 feet, Brabham was convinced he was flying a mistake. The controls felt heavy. The aircraft wallowed through turns. The climb rate was anemic. Everything the skeptics had predicted seemed true. At 5,000 feet, the P-47 still felt heavy and sluggish, exactly what it looked like. At 10,000, something began to change. The controls became more responsive. The engine note changed as the turbo supercharger began delivering compressed air. At 15,000 feet, the transformation was complete. At 20,000 feet, Brabham was laughing. The power was unbelievable. While other fighters gasped for air in the thin atmosphere, starving for oxygen, the P-47's turbo supercharger delivered sea-level performance. The Pratt & Whitney R2800, force-fed compressed air by the exhaust-driven turbo system, maintained its full 2,000 horsepower, where other engines produced barely half their rated output. Brabham pushed the throttle forward and felt acceleration that defied the aircraft's weight. The massive engine, no longer handicapped by thin air, drove the P-47 forward with locomotive force. He rolled it, surprisingly responsive at this altitude. The ailerons, heavy at low altitude, now bit into the thin air with precision. He pulled it into a climb. The rate of ascent actually improved above 20,000 feet, the opposite of every other fighter he'd flown. Then Brabham pushed the nose over and dove. The P-47 fell from the sky like it wanted to reach the ground. The airspeed indicator wound up rapidly. 200 miles per hour, 250, 300, 350, 400. Brabham had never gone this fast in an aircraft. 450, 500. The controls stiffened as shock waves began forming on the wings. 520, 540. At 550 miles per hour, Brabham pulled back on the stick. The P-47, its massive weight now an asset, converted speed to altitude in a zoom climb that took him from 15,000 feet back to 25,000 in seconds. He'd just performed a maneuver that would have torn the wings off any other fighter in existence. When he landed, Brabham's report was succinct. Test pilot reports aircraft exceeds all performance specifications above 15,000 feet. Dive performance unprecedented. Structural strength exceptional. Recommends immediate production. Alexander Kartveli, reading the report, allowed himself a rare smile. He'd built exactly what he intended. Not a dogfighter, not an interceptor in the traditional sense, but something new. A high-altitude juggernaut that would rewrite the rules of aerial combat. There was just one problem. When the first production models arrived at operational squadrons, nobody wanted to fly them. Act 1. The Curse. September 1942. Bridgeport, Connecticut. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke stood beside the runway, watching his 56th Fighter Group bury another pilot. That made 11 in 3 months. 11 men killed in training accidents. Not by Germans, not by Japanese, by their own aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived in August 1942, and Zemke's men hated it instantly. They'd trained on P-40 Warhawks, honest, straightforward airplanes that responded predictably. The P-40 wasn't fast, wasn't particularly maneuverable, but it was honest. You knew what it would do. The Thunderbolt felt like betrayal wrapped in aluminum. It ground-looped on landing, the massive propeller torque and narrow landing gear conspiring to spin the aircraft violently if the pilot wasn't precisely on centerline. It torque-rolled on takeoff, the engine's power trying to flip the aircraft inverted before the pilot could react. And it dove with such enthusiasm that pilots were discovering compressibility, their controls freezing solid as shock waves formed on the wings at speeds approaching the sound barrier. Speeds that shouldn't be possible for aircraft with propellers. Lieutenant Robert "Bob" Johnson, a 22-year-old farm kid from Lawton, Oklahoma, nearly died his first time in the P-47's cockpit. He'd been flying for 8 months, had accumulated 200 hours in the P-40, felt confident in his abilities. The Thunderbolt humbled him in less than 5 minutes. On final approach, practicing landing patterns, the P-47 dropped like a stone. Johnson had been flying his approach too slowly, a habit from the lighter P-40. The Thunderbolt, with its high wing loading, simply stopped flying. Johnson added full power, and the massive propeller torque rolled him inverted at 200 feet. Time slowed. Johnson saw the ground above him, saw his life ending, saw the aircraft spinning toward impact. Only instinct saved him. Opposite rudder, aileron against the roll, nose down to build airspeed, somehow leveling at 50 feet with the engine screaming and his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the stick. He landed, taxied to his revetment, climbed out, and vomited on the tarmac. "I'm putting in for a transfer," Johnson told Zemke that night. "This thing's a widowmaker. It's going to kill us all." Zemke, who'd been wrestling with the same doubts, who'd written 3 letters to headquarters requesting different aircraft, who'd attended 11 funerals in 3 months, made a decision that would change everything. No transfers. We learn the aircraft, or we die trying, and I'm betting we learn it. What followed was brutal empirical education. Every failure was analyzed, every accident investigated, every near miss studied. Slowly, painfully, patterns emerged. The P-47 wasn't a bad aircraft, it was a different aircraft. It required different techniques, different instincts, different thinking. Zemke instituted new procedures. Approach speeds increased by 20 miles per hour. Takeoffs required full right rudder anticipating the torque. Pilots learned to respect the dive, build speed gradually, recover with smooth pressure, never jerk the controls when approaching compressibility. Most importantly, Zemke drilled one concept into his pilots' heads. Don't try to fly it like a Spitfire. Accept the weight. Use the power. Understand that above 20,000 feet, the rules changed completely. By December, the accidents stopped. By January 1943, pilots were performing aerobatics in the massive fighter. By February, they were executing maneuvers that should have been impossible for an aircraft that heavy. Rolling scissors at altitude, split S recoveries, even Cuban 8s. By March, they were ready for combat. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Act 2. The Baptism. April 15, 1943. 27,000 feet above Pas-de-Calais, France. Feldwebel Kurt Boulegen of Jagdgeschwader 26 saw them first, climbing laboriously toward his formation through gaps in the cloud layer. Mein Gott! Look at the size of them. 16 P-47s climbed in tight formation below the German fighters. To pilots who'd fought Spitfires and Hurricanes, aircraft barely heavier than automobiles, the American fighters looked absurd. Massive radial engines that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. Fuselages like beer barrels. Wings that seemed too small for the bodies they supported. They climbed with all the grace of freight elevators, their pilots clearly struggling with the altitude. Americans have sent us target practice, Hauptmann Johannes Naumann transmitted from his Focke-Wulf FW-190. All flights, attack at will. The Germans had 4 years of combat experience. They destroyed the air forces of Poland, France, and had fought Britain to a standstill. They developed tactics against every Allied fighter type, knew every advantage, every weakness. They knew how Spitfires turned, how Hurricanes dove, how Soviet Yaks climbed. They knew nothing about Thunderbolts. Naumann's flight of 4 FW-190s attacked from above, executing textbook tactics. Dive from altitude, use speed to close, fire at close range, extend away before the enemy could react. They expected the Americans to turn, to try to outmaneuver them like Spitfires would. They expected to use their superior agility to outturn the heavy American fighters. Instead, the P-47s did something unexpected. They dove. The lead Thunderbolt rolled inverted and simply fell from the sky like it had been cut from strings. Naumann followed, watching his airspeed indicator climb rapidly. 400 kilometers per hour, 450, 500. At 550, his controls began to stiffen, the first warnings of compressibility. At 575, they locked solid. Naumann pulled back with all his strength. Nothing. The stick was immovable, the aircraft locked in its dive by forces he couldn't overcome. The American kept diving. 600 kilometers per hour, 650, speeds that should have torn the wings off any fighter. The P-47 dove through speeds that German fighters couldn't achieve even in vertical dives, speeds that defied everything Naumann knew about aircraft limitations. Then, at 8,000 feet, the P-47 pulled up smoothly, the pilot applying gradual back pressure, the massive airframe converting speed to altitude, and zoomed back to 25,000 feet in a climb that left Naumann's FW-190 wallowing behind, unable to follow. Naumann managed to recover his aircraft at 3,000 feet, his hands shaking, his aircraft shuddering from the stress of the dive. When he landed at Saint-Omer, his crew chief showed him the damage. Wing skin wrinkled from compression forces, rivets popped throughout the airframe, stress cracks forming in the wing roots. "Herr Feldwebel, what did you do to her?" the mechanic demanded, genuinely distressed at the damage. Naumann didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the American fighter that had done the same maneuver, dove faster, pulled out harder, and climbed away like nothing happened. "I tried to follow an American," Naumann finally said. "It was a mistake." The second encounter happened minutes later, and this time multiple German pilots were watching when the Americans fired their guns. A P-47 caught Unteroffizier Franz Schmidt in a shallow dive. The range was maybe 300 meters, too far for effective fire, every German pilot knew. Cannon were accurate to maybe 200 meters. Machine guns even less. You closed to point-blank range, 100 meters or less before firing. Then the American opened fire, and Schmidt's FW-190 simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Not damaged, obliterated. The wings separated from the fuselage at the wing roots. The tail broke off cleanly. The cockpit disintegrated into metal confetti. 3 seconds of fire, and Schmidt ceased to exist. The debris field spread across 2 kilometers of French countryside. Naumann watched it happen, couldn't process what he'd seen. He'd been flying combat for 3 years. He'd seen aircraft shot down hundreds of times. He'd never seen anything like this. The sheer violence of the destruction, the completeness of the annihilation. 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns firing in synchronization. Combined rate of fire, 6,000 rounds per minute. 100 half-inch projectiles per second, each weighing nearly 2 ounces, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. When all 8 guns converged at a single point, typically set at 300 yards, they created a zone of destruction unlike anything in the sky. German fighters carried 20mm cannon, individually more powerful than machine guns, but they had limited ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds per gun. Pilots learned to fire in short bursts, conserving ammunition. The guns had slow rates of fire, required precise aim, and frequently jammed under high G maneuvering. The P-47 carried 4,250 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total. At convergence distance, a pilot could hold the trigger for 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. The guns were electrically fired, individually heated to prevent freezing at altitude, and fed by electric boost motors that prevented jamming during violent maneuvers. The Americans could simply hold the trigger down and hose the sky with lead. Naumann's Staffel returned to base with 3 aircraft missing, 2 damaged. The Germans claimed 1 P-47 destroyed, later proven to be untrue. The American aircraft they'd hit multiple times had flown home, landed, and was repaired and flying again within 48 hours. That night, Naumann wrote in his diary, "We are fighting something we don't understand. The Americans have built a fighter that ignores the rules. It dives faster than we can follow. It climbs where we cannot reach. Its guns destroy aircraft from ranges we thought impossible. We shot one many times. It flew away. This is not good." Act 3. The Lesson. June 26, 1943, 24,000 feet over France. Lieutenant Robert Johnson was thinking about his girl back in Lawton when the 20mm cannon shell exploded through his canopy. The shell hit the canopy track directly behind his head, detonating on impact. The explosion sprayed metal fragments throughout the cockpit. Johnson felt impacts across his face and shoulder, shrapnel, glass, pieces of his own aircraft. Hot hydraulic fluid sprayed across his legs, immediately soaking through his flight suit. The engine coughed, belched black smoke, and started shaking violently. Through blood and oil covering his goggles, Johnson saw FW-190s circling like sharks, setting up for another pass. He'd been jumped, caught at the back of his formation by a perfect bounce from above. His wingman was gone, killed or scattered, he didn't know which. The rest of his flight was already 5 miles away, unable to help. He tried to bail out, grabbed the canopy release, pulled hard. Nothing. The canopy wouldn't move. The 20mm shell had exploded in the track mechanism, welding the canopy shut with melted aluminum. Johnson was trapped in a dying aircraft at 24,000 feet, with German fighters queuing up for killing passes. He did the only thing he could, pointed the nose toward England and prayed. What followed was one of the most extraordinary events in aerial warfare history. A lone FW-190 pilot, never definitively identified, though German records suggest it might have been Oberfeldwebel Willy Maximowitz of 2-JG-26, spotted the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel and attacked. The German pilot positioned perfectly, closed to point-blank range, and opened fire with all weapons. 4 20mm cannon shells exploded across Johnson's aircraft. Dozens of 13mm machine gun rounds stitched a line from nose to tail. The P-47 shuddered. Large pieces flew off, cowling panels, chunks of wing, sections of fuselage skin. The engine temperature spiked into the red zone. Oil pressure dropped. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel, flames licking at Johnson's legs. Johnson hunched behind the armor plate and waited for the end. The FW-190 pulled alongside, barely 50 feet away. The German pilot stared at the flying wreck, his expression clearly visible through the canopy. He looked confused, concerned, almost frightened. His guns should have destroyed the American fighter. Every hit looked solid. The Thunderbolt should be falling burning debris. Instead, it kept flying. The German pilot repositioned and attacked again. Another full burst, cannon ammunition exhausted now, just machine guns. Concentrated fire into the Thunderbolt's tail, fuselage, wings. The tail surfaces shredded like paper. The fuselage showed daylight through holes you could put your fist through. The engine was barely running, shaking so violently Johnson thought it would tear itself from the mounts. The P-47 kept flying. The FW-190 pulled alongside a third time. The German pilot shook his head slowly, his expression now clearly showing something like awe mixed with fear. He raised his hand, what looked unmistakably like a salute, and peeled away, turning back toward France. Johnson flew that aircraft 180 miles back to England on an engine that should have quit, with controls that barely responded, with his blood mixing with hydraulic fluid on the cockpit floor. The engine was running on 5 cylinders. The hydraulic system was gone. The electrical system flickering. The tail surfaces mostly gone. Half the rudder shot away. He landed at Manston, an emergency field on the English coast, with the engine seizing on the rollout. The aircraft stopped on the runway, smoke pouring from every opening. Ground crew ran to help him, then stopped in shock at what they were seeing. The crew chief climbed onto the wing, looked into the cockpit, and went pale. "Lieutenant, don't move. We need to see how you're still alive." They counted 210 bullet holes before giving up. 21 20mm cannon strikes, each capable of destroying an aircraft. The engine had taken 6 direct hits, cylinders shattered, crankcase cracked, oil lines severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through. 1 cannon shell had exploded 6 inches from Johnson's head, stopped by the 1/4-inch steel headrest. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat, the impact so violent it had torn the seat mounting from the floor. "Lieutenant," the crew chief said quietly, "this aircraft should not have brought you home. This aircraft should not exist. You should be dead 10 times over." Johnson, helped from the cockpit, legs weak from blood loss and shock, looked at the wreckage that had saved his life. He thought about the German pilot who'd expended all his ammunition and couldn't kill him. Thought about the armor that had stopped shells inches from his body. Thought about the engine that had kept running with half its cylinders destroyed. "Get her flying again," Johnson said. "I want this aircraft when she's repaired." "Sir, this aircraft will never fly again. She's a write-off." Johnson shook his head. "If she can get me home like this, I want her." They repaired the aircraft. Johnson flew it for another year, eventually naming it All Hell. He would survive the war with 27 confirmed victories, becoming one of America's top aces. But he never forgot June 26, 1943, the day the P-47 Thunderbolt proved it was more than just another fighter. When word spread through the Luftwaffe about an American fighter that absorbed an entire FW-190's ammunition load and survived, not just survived, but flew home, something changed. The mocking laughter stopped. The jokes about flying milk bottles died away. The Germans stopped laughing. They started being afraid. Act 4. The Hunters. August 17th, 1943. 28,000 feet above Germany. Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group had finally figured it out. After 4 months of combat, after losses and victories and hard lessons learned in blood, they understood what the P-47 was and how to use it. Don't dogfight. Don't turn. Don't try to climb with them at low altitude. Use altitude. Use speed. Use those 8 guns. Hunt from above. Kill from above. Escape to above. The tactic was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Climb to 30,000 feet, higher than German fighters could effectively operate. Wait for targets below. Roll inverted. Dive at speeds that made German pilots rip their aircraft apart trying to follow. Fire a 2-second burst from guns that never missed at 300 yards. Zoom back to altitude before the enemy could react. The Germans called it der Blitzangriff, the lightning attack. They had no effective counter for it. Zemke's pilots called it boom and zoom. It was devastatingly effective. That morning over Regensburg, escorting B-17s deep into Germany, Zemke demonstrated the tactic with textbook precision. His flight of 4 P-47s encountered a formation of 12 Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighters, positioning to attack the bombers. The twin-engine German aircraft were heavily armed with 30mm cannon and rockets, specialized bomber killers, but they were slow, unmaneuverable, and completely vulnerable to single-engine fighters. Perfect targets. Zemke checked his altitude, 32,000 feet. The Bf-110s were at 24,000, 8,000 feet below. He rolled inverted, pulled the stick back, and fell into his dive. The P-47 accelerated like a falling anvil, 400 miles per hour, 450. 500. The airframe vibrated but remained solid. 520. 530. The Bf-110s grew larger in his gun sight, completely unaware of the death diving from above. At 400 yards, still diving at over 500 miles per hour, Zemke centered the sight on the lead Bf-110 and pressed the trigger. 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns fired in perfect synchronization. The sound inside the cockpit was like being inside a drum, a rapid hammering that you felt through your entire body. Spent brass ejected from beneath the wings in glittering streams. The guns created a sustained roar that lasted 2 full seconds. 2 seconds. 160 rounds. 160 half-inch projectiles, each weighing nearly 2 ounces, each traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, all converging in a zone 6 feet in diameter. The lead Bf-110 didn't crash. It didn't fall. It disintegrated. The wings folded upward and backward, metal fatigue failures propagating along the wing spars at supersonic speed. The fuselage broke in half just behind the wing roots. The cockpit simply ceased to exist. The crew compartment transformed into an expanding cloud of aluminum fragments, glass, and other materials that used to be 2 men. The engines tore free from their mounts, tumbling separately toward the ground thousands of feet below. 2 seconds of fire. 1 aircraft transformed into falling debris. Zemke zoomed back to altitude, converting his dive speed into a climb that took him back to 33,000 feet. His wingmen each destroyed another Bf-110 on the same pass. 3 aircraft obliterated in less than 10 seconds. By the time the German formation reacted, all 4 Americans were back at 30,000 feet, untouchable, ready for another attack. The surviving Bf-110s scattered and fled, abandoning their attack on the B-17s. They'd lost 4 aircraft, 1/3 of their formation, in under 10 seconds. They hadn't fired a single shot, hadn't damaged a single American aircraft. Most of them hadn't even seen the P-47s until after the attack was over. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, a gunner in one of the surviving Bf-110s, was shot down 3 weeks later and interrogated by American intelligence. His testimony about the August 17th attack was revealing. Before the P-47s, we feared the Spitfires. They could turn with us, outclimb us at low altitude. But we could fight them. Our cannon against their machine guns, we had advantages if we flew smart. The Thunderbolts are different. They don't fight. They execute. You never see them until the guns fire. Then your aircraft is gone. My pilot saw the attack that killed the lead aircraft. He said it was like God reached down and swatted the Messerschmitt from the sky. Everything went black. He said he couldn't see anything but fragments and smoke. I was in the rear, watching for fighters behind us. I felt our aircraft shake from the explosion of the lead ship. I turned and there was just nothing. Where there had been an aircraft with two friends, there was just empty sky and falling pieces. My pilot said the Americans didn't just shoot the aircraft. They erased it. One moment it existed, the next moment it was atoms. By September 1943, Luftwaffe pilots had developed a saying. Achtung, Thunderbolt, wasn't a warning, it was a eulogy. By the time you heard the warning, you were already dead. The Americans had learned to hunt. Act 5, the breaking. October 8, 1943, 31,000 feet over Bremen, Germany. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp was one of Germany's best. 206 confirmed victories. Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords dangling at his throat. Veteran of Spain, Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. He'd survived over 500 combat missions. If anyone could survive against the Thunderbolts, it should have been Hans Philipp. At 31,000 feet, his FW-190A6 was struggling. The BMW 801 radial engine, powerful at medium altitudes, was oxygen-starved in the thin air nearly 6 miles above the Earth. The aircraft felt sluggish, unresponsive, like swimming through honey. Every control input required extra effort. The engine temperature was climbing despite the freezing air, the supercharger struggling to deliver enough oxygen for combustion. Philipp was defending Bremen from another American bombing raid. Dozens of B-17s below, protected by swarms of American fighters. His job was to break through the escorts, get to the bombers, and destroy as many as possible before withdrawing. It was what he'd done hundreds of times. It was what he was good at. What he didn't know was that Bob Johnson, the pilot who'd survived the unsurvivable just 3 months earlier, was hunting 33,000 feet above him. Johnson had learned a lot since June. He'd become an ace with 8 confirmed kills. He'd mastered the Thunderbolt's strengths and accepted its weaknesses. Most importantly, he'd learned that altitude was life. The higher you were, the more options you had. Height meant speed. Speed meant surprise. Surprise meant kills. Johnson spotted Philipp's flight of 4 FW-190s climbing toward the bombers. He watched them struggle through the thin air, noting their slow speed, their labored climb. He positioned his flight for a perfect bounce, diving from directly above and behind, invisible against the sun. Tally-ho! 4 bandits. Angels 31. Climbing. I'm in. Johnson rolled inverted and dove. His 3 wingmen followed, their P-47s falling from the sky in perfect formation. 400 miles per hour. 450. 500. 520. The diving aircraft screamed through the thin air, building speed that German fighters couldn't match. Philipp never saw them. The first indication of attack was when Johnson's guns opened fire at 350 yards. Johnson's combat report, filed 3 hours later, was clinical in its precision. Identified enemy formation at 31,000 feet. Attacked from above with 4-ship flight. Selected leader aircraft with distinctive yellow nose markings. Opened fire at 350 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage, concentrated fire on cockpit area. Enemy aircraft exploded. Large pieces separated from main fuselage. No parachute observed. Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most experienced and decorated fighter pilots, survived 500 combat missions on 2 fronts against every Allied fighter type. He died in approximately 2 seconds to a 23-year-old American farm boy with less than 1/10 his experience. The death of Hans Philipp sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If Philipp couldn't survive, Philipp, who'd been flying fighters since before most Allied pilots were born, who could? The message was clear. Experience didn't matter against physics. Courage didn't matter against firepower. Skill didn't matter when the enemy could choose the time, place, and altitude of every engagement. By November 1943, German fighter pilot morale was collapsing. New pilots arrived at frontline units, expecting to hear stories of glory and victory. Instead, they heard one thing, repeated by every veteran with the 1,000-yard stare of too much combat. Avoid the Thunderbolts. Don't fight them at altitude. Don't dive with them. Don't assume you can survive just because you're a good pilot. The Americans could be mediocre pilots and the best fighter in the sky and still kill you. The aircraft did half the work. The guns did the rest. Act 6. The Hammer. June 6, 1944. Dawn over Normandy. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, commander of JG-26, climbed toward the invasion fleet with his wingmen. They were the only 2 German fighters to reach the beaches that morning, the only 2 out of hundreds that should have been there. The rest were already dead. The sky belonged to the Americans. Priller counted them as he climbed, his experienced eye cataloging the formations. Thunderbolts at 5,000 feet, flying cap, combat air patrol, over the beaches. More at 10,000. Still more at 15, 20, 25,000 feet. They were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet, an impenetrable umbrella of American fighters. He'd tried to lead 12 fighters from his Gruppe to attack the invasion fleet at dawn. 12 had taken off. 11 were shot down before reaching the coast. 11 aircraft, 11 pilots, most of them experienced veterans, men who'd survived years of combat, gone in 20 minutes. Priller made one strafing pass over the beaches, his guns barely scratching the massive invasion, and fled back to France with American fighters swarming after him. "We tried to break through at dawn," Priller reported to headquarters later that day. 12 fighters from our Gruppe. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them. They were at 30,000 feet. Couldn't dive under them. They were at the deck. Couldn't run. They were faster. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. But D-Day was just the beginning. What followed was systematic destruction of everything that moved in occupied France. The P-47, it turned out, wasn't just a fighter. It was a weapon system that redefined ground attack. Each Thunderbolt could carry 2,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to medium bombers from 1939. Later variants added 10 5-inch HVAR rockets, high-velocity aircraft rockets, each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. Combined with 850 caliber machine guns that could penetrate tank armor from certain angles, the P-47 became a flying artillery battery. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition used by American fighters could penetrate up to 1 inch of armor plate at close range. German tanks typically had 1 to 2 inches of top armor, thinner than side or front armor because designers never anticipated attack from directly above. The P-47, diving at steep angles, could punch through and ignite fuel or ammunition. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. They came in so low you could see the pilots' faces through the cockpit glass. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring like thunder, rockets screaming like banshees, then those heavy machine guns hammering. I watched a column of 20 trucks simply cease to exist. Not destroyed, vaporized. In one pass, maybe 30 seconds, an entire transport company transformed into burning wreckage. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. We called them jabos, fighter bombers. But these were something beyond that. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. My men would hear the engines and simply abandon their vehicles, running for any cover. Better to be a coward alive than a hero dead. The statistics from June 1944 alone tell the story. 651 locomotives destroyed, 3,847 trucks destroyed, 512 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. The Wehrmacht, once the most mobile army in the world, was forced to move only at night. The Germans owned the night. The Americans owned everything that daylight touched. By August, German soldiers had developed dark humor about their situation. If you see a silver aircraft, it's American. If you see a camouflaged aircraft, it's British. If you see no aircraft at all, it's the Luftwaffe. The 9th Air Force, primarily equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties between D-Day and the end of the war. They dropped 120,000 tons of bombs. They fired 135 million rounds of ammunition. They launched 60,000 rockets. They achieved a 4.6-to-1 kill ratio in aerial combat, while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. The Germans tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armor. The P-47s used rockets instead. They deployed more anti-aircraft guns. The Thunderbolts attacked from different angles. They developed new camouflage techniques. American pilots learned to spot the unnatural patterns. They tried moving only at night. The Allies brought in night fighters. Nothing worked. The P-47's combination of speed, armor, and firepower made them nearly unstoppable. Even the feared 88mm flak guns struggled to track the fast-moving fighters at low altitude. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction meant that aircraft could absorb multiple flak hits and still complete their missions. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Basler, commanding the 325th Fighter Group, flew 72 missions in P-47s. His aircraft was hit by flak 43 times. He brought it home 43 times. The P-47 was built by people who understood that pilots wanted to go home, Basler said after the war. Every system had redundancy. The engine could lose half its cylinders and keep running. The control cables were doubled. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The armor wasn't just behind the pilot. It was everywhere that mattered. You felt safe in that cockpit, even when you shouldn't have. Act 7. The Reckoning. March 2nd, 1945. Luftwaffe Interrogation Center, Oberursel, Germany. The interrogation room was cold. Coal for heating had been diverted to more critical needs. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, the same pilot who'd mocked the P-47s as pregnant cows in April 1943, sat across from a German propaganda officer seeking morale-boosting quotes about German fighter superiority. The officer was young, maybe 20, hadn't seen combat. He had a notebook and an earnest expression, and absolutely no idea how badly the war was going. Herr Hauptmann, for our radio broadcast, can you describe the superiority of German fighter aircraft over American types? Priller, now 32 years old but looking 50, stared at the young officer for a long moment. He'd been flying combat since 1939. He'd survived 6 years of war that had killed most of his friends. He'd watched the Luftwaffe transform from the most powerful air force in the world to scattered remnants hiding from American fighters. He was done lying. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built, Priller said flatly. Its firepower is unprecedented. Weapons that never jam, never overheat, never run out of ammunition in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed. But beyond the machine is what it represents: unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage, and courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We mocked their fat fighters, their inexperienced pilots, their crude tactics. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, that sound, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us, mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. You want something for your broadcast? Here it is. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead, and we deserved it, because we started this war thinking courage and experience could defeat industry. We were wrong. The propaganda officer stared at his notebook, pen frozen. This was not what he'd come for. I cannot use this, Herr Hauptmann. I know, Priller said tiredly. Nobody wants to hear the truth, but it's still the truth. The numbers supported Priller's despair. Republic Aviation had built 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts by war's end. At peak production, the Farmingdale, New York factory completed one Thunderbolt every hour, around the clock, 7 days a week. The Evansville, Indiana plant, built from empty farmland in 1942, produced 500 aircraft per month by 1944. Each aircraft required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone contained 2,400 individual components, machined to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. The propeller required 53 separate manufacturing processes. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision that exceeded peacetime standards. Quality control rejected aircraft for defects that German aircraft left the factory with routinely. The ammunition production was equally staggering. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, ammunition consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri alone produced 30 million rounds monthly. Each cartridge was manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, ensuring reliable feeding through the synchronized gun mechanisms. The fuel consumption was enormous. Each Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons per hour in combat with water injection engaged. The 9th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944. All of it shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of American mass production. More devastating than aircraft production, pilot production. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots annually from flight training. Each received a minimum of 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. German pilots were entering combat with less than 100 hours total flying time by war's end. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in Europe in September 1944, exemplified the American training advantage. I had 420 hours in my logbook when I arrived at my squadron. Including 75 hours in the P-47, I knew the aircraft inside and out. I'd fired at towed targets for 30 hours, practiced deflection shooting, studied gun camera film from actual combat. I'd flown formation for hundreds of hours. I'd done instruments, navigation, aerobatics. My first mission, I knew exactly what to do. I knew how to position for an attack, how to lead a target, how to manage my energy, how to escape if things went wrong. The German pilot I faced that day couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight. I killed him in one pass. He never saw me coming. The quality difference showed everywhere. American pilots arrived in Europe understanding their aircraft systems intimately. They'd studied technical manuals that German pilots never received. They knew fuel consumption rates, engine limitations, electrical system redundancies. They could troubleshoot problems in flight, nurse damaged aircraft home, maximize their equipment's performance. German pilots got a brief checkout flight and were sent to combat. Many died without ever understanding what their aircraft could do. Act 8, The Silence. May 8, 1945. Occupied Germany. The war in Europe ended not with a bang, but with silence. The Luftwaffe, which had once owned the skies over Europe, which had terrorized cities and destroyed air forces, which had seemed invincible in 1940, had been systematically destroyed. Not defeated, obliterated. Not conquered, annihilated. By May 1945, there were no German fighters left to fight. The factories that built them were rubble. The fuel to fly them was gone. The pilots to fly them were dead or captured. The will to continue fighting had evaporated in the face of overwhelming material superiority. The final statistics of P-47 operations defied comprehension. 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 86,000 railway cars destroyed, 68,000 trucks destroyed, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed, 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. In the Pacific Theater, 697 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 destroyed on the ground, countless vehicles, locomotives, barges, and installations destroyed. But statistics don't tell the real story. Behind those numbers lay the human cost, not just the Germans and Japanese who died, but what their deaths represented. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against Western Allied forces between 1942 and 1945. Many fell to the concentrated fire of American heavy machine guns. Each loss represented years of training that Germany could never replace. By war's end, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. The technical superiority was overwhelming. The industrial superiority was crushing. But perhaps the most devastating aspect was psychological. German pilots developed what medical officers called Jabo fever, physical symptoms of stress appearing when Thunderbolts were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without fear became physically ill before missions against P-47s. The distinctive thunder of approaching Thunderbolts, created by the massive four-bladed propeller with tips approaching supersonic speeds, could be heard from miles away. German ground troops learned to identify that sound and knew it meant death from above. They called it Donnerkeule, Thunder Club, the Hammer of God. At the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberursel, captured Allied pilots were routinely debriefed by German intelligence officers seeking tactical information. The records, captured intact in 1945, revealed German assessments of Allied aircraft throughout the war. The file on the P-47, updated continuously, showed the complete reversal of opinion. April 1943. Large, unmaneuverable fighter, inferior to German types in all performance parameters except dive speed. Machine gun armament insufficient against cannon-armed fighters. Assessment, minimal threat. December 1943. Exceptional high-altitude performance, extreme structural strength, firepower increasingly problematic, pilots showing improved tactics. Assessment, significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Dominant fighter bomber, superior to all German types above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against all target types. Structural strength makes shoot-down extremely difficult. Assessment, critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Best fighter bomber of the war. Combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment, unsurvivable in direct engagement. Recommend avoidance. Epilogue. The Legacy. October 1985. Phoenix, Arizona. German and American fighter pilots reunion. Former adversaries met in peace, old men now, gathering to remember and reconcile. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm. Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, one of Germany's most decorated pilots, stood before a crowd of American veterans. Someone asked him about the P-47. Galland was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear. We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we said. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the aircraft that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were absolutely right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was incredible, like nothing we had. The cockpit was comfortable, spacious, well-designed. The visibility was excellent. The controls were precise. It was a pilot's aircraft, wrapped in armor, armed with devastating weapons. But what really impressed me, what made me realize we never had a chance, was understanding that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything we produced. Each one required precision manufacturing we couldn't match. Yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew. We never had a chance. Not against that industrial capacity, not against that determination, not against those guns. He paused, his expression distant, remembering. Those guns. We called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made. 8 guns firing in harmony, like a deadly musical instrument. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe. It destroyed it. Systematically, completely, inevitably. And we deserved it, because we started a war we couldn't finish. The room was silent. American veterans who had flown the Thunderbolt, who had survived the war in that massive cockpit, who had brought their aircraft home with battle damage that should have killed them, they stood and applauded. Not in triumph, but in respect, for their aircraft, for their fallen enemies, for the truth Gallant had spoken. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from World War I. Its weapons delivered more firepower than an infantry platoon. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by kids barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. It represented American engineering philosophy perfectly. Build it strong enough to survive, arm it well enough to kill anything it can see, and produce it in quantities that make loss acceptable. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters. Its placard lists specifications and battle honors, but the real story is told by a small display case nearby containing spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrating under fire. Below the display is a quote from an unnamed German pilot, taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight by our rules. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb or follow our rules. They made their own rules. They just pointed those guns at you, and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat in April 1943 as an object of derision, the Jug, mocked by German pilots as a flying milk bottle, feared by American pilots who called it a widowmaker. It ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. Donnerkeil, the Thunder Club, the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe. In between, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the German fighter arm under an avalanche of lead. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The sky belonged to the Thunder Club. The sky belonged to America. And the thunder, that terrible, beautiful thunder of 8 guns firing in harmony, had spoken its final word.